Okay, so we're going to pick up an example of fine dining. And fine dining, I think, is an example that you could run in your tute very easily with very little preparation. Okay, so first we'll look at journey maps. So the purpose of the journey map was to describe a process, but from a user's perspective. So if we look at the journey map of going and having a meal at a nice restaurant, then you might go to the restaurant, you'd find a seat, take a seat, sort of check in and make sure you've got your reservation. You'd order some food. Obviously, each of these steps has smaller steps inside it, such as having a look at the menu before you order your food. Maybe between ordering food and getting your food, you're going to have a good conversation. When the food comes, you're going to eat dinner. Eventually, you'll have to pay the bill. And once you've done that, you can leave. So if we look at this as a very general journey map, each of these steps you could go into more detail. So for example, the ordering food step could go into more detail. The eating dinner could very easily go into more detail. The paying the bill, the getting to the restaurant. What you could do is present this as a basic starting point and give each group a different substep to then go and look in the detail. So the ordering food step might involve getting the menu, deciding, looking at the wine list, calling the waiter, ordering your food. And you could map out each of those different journeys separately. Let's jump to stakeholder analysis. So once you've mapped out those smaller little journeys within the longer chain, you could perhaps get different groups to look at the stakeholders involved with the different steps. So if we take the order food example and look at a stakeholder map for that, obviously the customer is probably in the middle of this situation. They're probably going to interact with the waiter. The waiter probably interacts with the bartender, who might sort out your drinks, would deliver the order to the chef. The chef probably has a sous chef and a number of other people that might help the kitchen. The chef also probably interacts with the people that bring the food, so maybe the food distributor. The food distributor probably liaises with people like farmers who might be preparing the meat. They might be also interacting with the breeders of the plants and animals. The chef and the waiter probably interact with the restaurant manager, as does the bartender. The manager probably interacts with the owner of the restaurant. Sometimes they're the same person. The owner may or may not have a company behind them, if it's a big chain restaurant, for example, or if it's quite a large, high-end restaurant, you'd have a company behind it, and you might even have a board of directors behind that company. Board of directors probably interact with people like lawyers, probably interact with accountants to make sure the books are in order. They will also probably interact with people like the banks to make sure that they've got finance and capital. The owner and the manager might interact with admin. So it's really important to note that the waiter might also interact with admin, but their relationship is very different. The admin probably has a local accountant who probably does all the books, and maybe a payroll officer, maybe they're the same person who runs payroll. So very quickly we get from this ordering food stakeholder map to a very sort of messy mud map of all these different stakeholders. If you were to do a different stakeholder analysis for each of these different steps, you might also see things like in the pay bill, the bank might overlap through a payment gateway, and suddenly some of these stakeholders become quite important to the way a business is run. You could pick a few of these people, so maybe you might want to pick the chef, the manager, the customer, the waiter, the board of directors, maybe, and then pick up a question like, look at the question, improving the restaurant experience. So if we're looking at that as a problem, you might do an interest and influence map. Any of the axes on these sorts of maps can be interchanged. So if you wanted to look at power, if you wanted to look at time versus money, you could map people out. So the purpose is to then see where they all fit. So you might pick up your chef and decide that they might have a high influence on the menu and a high interest because they're wanting to make their restaurant really good and wanting to get more customers. The board of directors probably has a lot of influence probably has moderate interest in the running of the restaurant, but also wants it to be quite a good experience. Somebody like the customer has probably very low influence, but high interest. So they don't really mind if they have a bad experience at this fine dining restaurant because they're just not going to. The next step that you could look at is take all of these different stakeholders and building a system boundary map. So the system boundary map asks you to look at who is, well, you could use it for stakeholders. You can also use it for a bunch of other different like functions or components of a system. We're going to use it for stakeholders here. So if we're looking at the question of improving the restaurant, you'd have people who are inside the system boundary, stakeholders who are outside the system boundary, and stakeholders who we're going to exclude from the question at stake. This might just be temporarily, it might be permanently. And you'd build up a map and you'd put all the different stakeholders around them. If we go back up to our stakeholder map, a good way to run this tute might be to get all of these stakeholders on different post-it notes. And those post-it notes could be put on the whiteboard and you could map out the relationships. And then the post-it notes could also then come onto this map of where you might improve the restaurant experience and then eventually find their way onto the inside, outside, and excluded. So if you were to look at the people who are inside the system of influence, you would look at people like the waiter, the manager, the chef, the bartender, all of your employees because you can control them. The owner is probably inside. So all of these guys are probably inside your system of interest. It's arguable as to whether the company board of directors might be inside, but perhaps if you're the owner, you might see them as an external stakeholder because you don't have direct influence over them, they have direct influence over you. If you were to pick out all of the external people, so the customer is obviously external, you can't control them, you can try but you can't. The company might be external, all of these guys might be external. The food distributor is going to be external, the farmers and the breeder. But then there are some that you also want to exclude. So for the purpose of improving the restaurant experience, you might want to exclude people like the banks, the accountants, the lawyers, maybe even the board of directors. You might want to exclude people like the breeder and the farmer, or maybe they're a really important part of the strategy of improving your restaurant. This might be a really interesting way to run your tute. Take it on as food for thought, but hopefully this gives you some ideas as to how you can combine all three activities in quite a quick and easy way. Good luck.